Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing the documentary Black Box Diaries, currently out in theaters in both the US and the UK. So briefly, Black Box Diaries follows Shiori Ito, who documents her sexual assault case in Japan. The documentary is based on a book by the same name. The book, which I highly recommend, documents the obstacles Shiori had to go through to not only report her crime, but to hold her assailant accountable. The documentary is part investigation and part video diary of her very long and exhausting journey for justice. I thought the video diaries did an excellent job of helping us understand the toll being assaulted has on someone's everyday life. It also utilizes audio recordings of police, media, and other government officials. These recordings are essential in helping us understand just how difficult it is to hold men, particularly men in positions of power, accountable for their crimes, not just legally, but also in the media. The documentary opens up with a barely conscious Shiori being dragged out of a taxi and into a hotel. Despite eyewitness accounts from the doorman and even the taxi driver, who states that Shiori asked multiple times to be dropped off at a train station and be allowed to go home, the police not only were reluctant to investigate, they actively discouraged her from trying to report. The documentary does not focus on the man who assaulted her. It does not seek to dox him or look into any other crimes he may have committed. Instead, the documentary is very much focused on the process of reporting and investigating sexual assault cases in Japan. From her story, the documentary highlights critical changes that need to be made to the Japanese legal system to make it easier for victims to come forward and report their cases. I think one of the most important issues this documentary highlights is just how difficult it is for victims to simply come forward. It's one thing for a case to be investigated and then thrown out. It's another thing for a case to be thrown out before it's even investigated. Like, that's a travesty. Now, when the documentary begins, you're not really sure who to blame. At first, you want to blame the police officer for not doing his job, but as the documentary goes on, it becomes quite clear that the threshold for investigating sexual assault cases in Japan is so high that even if the police wanted to look into it, there are certain criteria that have to be met. For example, consent is not even a factor. Simply being in the same room as someone can actually constitute as consent. An individual would have to prove grave bodily harm, and if they're unable to prove that, they would need clear-cut evidence like a video, pictures, audio recordings, which of course is absent in most of these cases. And the heavy burden placed on the victim is felt throughout this documentary. And I think using the audio recordings to narrate the film was very useful in understanding just how draconian and traumatizing the legal system is for victims of sexual assault cases in Japan. Now, oftentimes victims don't really want to report because they don't want to be shamed. In the documentary, Shiori explains how she was asked to reenact her crime using a doll in front of a large group of men. Even the resources available to women following an assault is quite limited. In the documentary, you can see that Shiori was surrounded by friends and family, and I kept thinking, what about a woman that didn't have this support system and they were actively looking for a support system? Where would they go? Who would they talk to? Are these people in places sensitive enough to actually give them the support that they need? In the book, she describes visiting a number of clinics and facilities that were set up for victims of assault. However, as well-intentioned as these places were, they often felt very cold and uninviting. Now, her only other refuge as a journalist was to turn to the media, and unfortunately the media wanted nothing to do with this story, and for good reason. Her assailant was a known businessman, a journalist. He even wrote the biography for the Prime Minister, so no one really wanted to experience any pushback. Many of these setbacks Shiori faced during this investigation would be hard to believe had it not been for these audio recordings. At one point, they were actually ready to arrest him, and at the last minute, the arrest warrant was canceled. And to make matters worse, the officer investigating her case was removed, and they had lost all this momentum they had gained. It's one thing for the state to deter an investigation, it's another for the state to actively engage and interfere with it. And you would think that this would be enough for the media to at least do some reporting or look into it, but they just wanted nothing to do with it. It was further proof that this was not a situation they wanted to get involved in. And Shiori's case brought up an ugly truth about sexual assault in Japan, which is that it places an enormous burden on individuals to avoid being assaulted. And ultimately, the law is a reflection of that culture. During a press conference, Shiori was criticized heavily for her appearance. They didn't like that her blouse was not buttoned all the way to the top, and they felt that this gave them enough proof to question her right to be called a victim. She was slandered. She was receiving a lot of hate. And one line that really struck out at me in her book is, "Until I became a victim, I did not comprehend how violent sexual assault is." This violence extends beyond the assault. The more she tried to speak about what had happened to her, the more violence she received, the more pushback, the more threats. I think when dealing with rape culture in general, it extends beyond the law. In the book, she documents a number of other incidences of sexual harassment she experienced when she was young. For example, one form of harassment that's very common in Japan is called chicane, and this usually happens in very crowded places like buses or trains. And essentially, men just come up behind you and start groping and grabbing you. And she describes how she would come up with strategies to avoid this. And she goes on to list a number of other experiences of being groped and grabbed by men who are not held accountable. Like, there's really nothing she felt she could do. I think when you normalize sexual harassment, why would you take sexual assault seriously? I think Shiori's case for the first time forced the state to have a public conversation about sexual assault laws and how draconian they are. This is clearly not a conversation anyone wanted to have. The documentary utilizes footage from all these parliamentary government debates, and you can just see how uncomfortable everyone is, because sexual assault very much exists in a black box in this private space between two people. The logic being that because no one can see what happens behind closed doors, this is not a public issue. This is a private issue. And this is the reason her assailant was able to avoid criminal charges, because he claimed that it was a misunderstanding between two adults. And this idea that sexual assault exists in a black box is really damaging, because victims don't really want to come forward because they feel the state will not intervene or protect them or do anything to help them. And when you frame it as a black box, it makes it seem like it's between two private citizens, and the state really should not be interfering. Shiori's case was very important because it sparked the Me Too movement in Japan. And I think Me Too was very important because it highlighted how underreported sexual assault is and how difficult it is for most people to simply come forward and just report the crime, right? Like, just report the crime. We can deal with the investigation later, but we need to encourage people to report what happens to them, because the more people that report, the easier it is to make changes in the legal system. When the documentary starts, Shiori asks, like, "What do you know about me?" You probably think of me as the woman who was assaulted. And I think so many women don't want to report their crime because they're afraid that people will see them as a victim. And I think what Shiori's case did was that it took sexual assault out of the black box. And the more people that report, that shame can be reversed onto the assailant and onto the legal system to create a space where people do feel safe to at least speak out about what has happened to them. And that's really the only way that change can be forced. Like, you have to talk about it, otherwise nothing will happen. So overall, I think this is an excellent documentary. I think it's well worth watching. And I think the book is very much is worth reading. Like, you feel like you're on the journey with her. Like, I think that's what I loved about the book and the documentary. Like, you feel her setbacks, you feel the pain, and it's almost hard to believe. Like, you're like, how is this happening? Like, she tries time and time again to come forward, but she's just met with roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. So you end up feeling just as exhausted and as tired as she is, really. And so please look out for this movie. Let me know what you think, and until next time.